Hello and welcome to the True Man podcast, the podcast designed to create a generation of self-defined men. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Alejandro Sanchez, the human rights lead at the National Secular Society. Alejandro, it's an absolute pleasure. How are you doing?
Very well, thanks, Lewis. Thanks so much for having me.
Awesome. I'm excited for this one. It's a little bit of a different one. It's really leaning into what I want to do with the podcast, which is really start to build out that resource for men and start to build that out a lot. So I'm excited for this one a lot. But first, and as always, Alejandro, in your own words, what makes you a man?
Yeah, it's a good question. To me, being a man is taking responsibility for your actions. It's standing up for those who are unable to defend themselves. It's being stoical when there's cause for stoicism, but also being strong enough to ask for help when you need it. And I think it's also hoping that everyone in our society is flourishing, men and women, boys and girls. It's not a zero-sum game. One doesn't come at the expense of the other, and it shouldn't be treated as such.
Amazing. Why don't you explain a little bit what the National Secular Society is?
Yeah, absolutely. So the National Secular Society is an NGO. We're based in London. We've been around since 1866. Secularism. So secularism is not atheism. Atheism is a sort of religious position that God doesn't exist. Secularism is a political position. It's the idea that the state should be neutral when it comes to matters of religion. So faith should be neither privileged nor disadvantaged in public life. And that means secularism is for everyone, of all religions and none. So we campaign for a secular democracy in which everyone is treated equally, regardless of religion or belief. And that means protecting everybody's right to believe as they see fit and to manifest that belief right up to the point that it starts to infringe on the rights of others. And that means we have to challenge religious privilege where we see it. So we still have 26 reserved seats for bishops in the House of Lords. We still have blasphemy laws in Northern Ireland. We work to repeal mandatory Christian worship in state-funded schools. And then finally, when it comes to circumcision, we campaign to protect all children from ritual genital cutting. And just by way of personal background, I'm also a retired NHS doctor, and I have a medical ethics and law MA from King's.
Amazing. So it's quite an interesting, quite a meaty space that you're in, but as you sort of touched on at the end there, it's sort of that religious circumcision is sort of part of the conversation that we're going to have today. Why don't you explain a little bit of what it is that campaign is sort of focusing on at the moment?
Yeah, so perhaps it'd be useful to talk about some of the sort of different types of circumcision. So the first one is those that are medically urgent. And we have absolutely no problem with those. Of course, we'd recommend that less invasive measures, if they're useful, are taken first. But when it comes to children, those are very rare. So we know from Royal College of Surgeons guidance that there's only one absolute indication to be performing a medically necessary circumcision on children. That's for a condition called pathological phimosis. So that's when, as a result of either infection or scarring, that the foreskin can't be pulled back. And then the other big category of circumcisions are non-therapeutic circumcisions. So that's what we're here to talk about today. Here in the UK, those are almost exclusively religious circumcisions. So practiced within the Jewish and Islamic communities. And perhaps it'd be useful just to say a little bit about each of those. So in the Jewish tradition, circumcision is carried out on the 8th day of life. It represents a covenant between the individual and God. In Islam, it's a highly recommended or sunnah practice recommended by the Prophet Muhammad. It represents a form of cleanliness or purity. So that those are the main forms in the UK, but across the globe, in the US, it's performed as a sort of cultural prophylactic measure. So newborn boys are often circumcised in hospital on sort of hygiene or claimed health benefits grounds. Although it's interesting to note that there's a new study out of Johns Hopkins University a couple of weeks ago, which found that circumcision rates in the US had fallen below 50% for the first time. Actually, perhaps while we're on the US, some of your listeners may have heard recently that the health secretary there, RFK Jr., recently claimed that there was a link between circumcision and autism. And while I think that there are plenty of good reasons to oppose non-therapeutic circumcision of children, that's certainly not one of them. And then finally, non-therapeutic circumcision, I guess I'll just call that circumcision for the rest of the podcast for ease of use, can also be a sort of adolescent rite of passage. So in South Africa, that's the purpose it serves there, and it really can be quite dangerous when it's performed in that way. So last year in South Africa in 2024, there were over 90 deaths from circumcision with 11 penile amputations.
I think JFK is pretty much throwing everything into that realm
right.
of discourse of autism. So I would be surprised if you hadn't have caught some strays from that. I guess the first thing is sort of, I guess, a little bit of clarification on the benefits that are sort of precluded within these religious sort of ideologies, one being sort of cleanliness and a health benefit. Is there any sort of parallels to that? Is there any truth in these statements?
So when it comes to cleanliness, just like any other part of the body, the foreskin, the penis can be cleaned. Water, soap. We don't cut off other parts of the body because they might present a difficulty in cleaning. Hygiene, I don't think there's a compelling reason to circumcise on that basis. I think very few people would maintain that claim. And then when it comes to the health benefits, the claimed health benefits, I guess first of all, they have to be stacked against the risks that come with circumcision. All surgeries are inherently dangerous. And here in the UK, so the British Medical Association in 2019, they said that the claimed health benefits are an insufficient basis to be circumcising children on. You can't get a circumcision on the NHS based on the health benefits. In fact, in the UK, the only place you can get a circumcision on the NHS is in Scotland. That's only for religious reasons. And they will only do it after 6 months and with a general anesthetic. They say that it's safer and less painful for the child on that basis, which I think does raise some very serious questions about, those circumcisions which are not being performed with a general anesthetic. We know religious groups either use a local anesthetic or no anesthetic whatsoever. And then I guess perhaps the sort of most common health claim of circumcision is that it prevents or helps prevent transmission of female to male HIV. So what I would say to that is, first of all, babies shouldn't need protection from sexually transmitted HIV. And the World Health Organization, it recommends circumcision as a means of preventing HIV when it's voluntary for men in countries that have a high prevalence of HIV. So none of that applies in the UK to children.
So you talk about the fact that you can get it done in Scotland, but other than that, you have sort of backstreet sort of operations, I guess, is probably the best way of describing those. How do you manage the campaign that you're trying to do whilst also not trying to increase the risk, so we say? So when these sort of operations are taking place, it's probably safe to say there's more chance of serious long-term problems. There's probably a chance of death and things like that. How do you find a balance between creating this campaign without pushing it further underground?
Yeah, so I mean, perhaps it'd be useful just to clarify the legal position on circumcision here in the UK. Doctors can perform it privately, and when that's the case, they're subject to the usual regulation of the General Medical Council and the CQC, the Care Quality Commission. But then there is no legal requirement for circumcisers to be medically trained or even to have proven expertise. So you, Lewis, could perfectly legally perform a circumcision. Any of your listeners could legally perform a circumcision. So yeah, in terms of mitigating the harm, well, we think at the National Secular Society that circumcision should be treated like any other surgery. So that means it should be performed by a doctor, and it means when it comes to children that it should only be performed with medical necessity. And I think that follows a sort of standard safeguarding and medical ethics approach. So child safeguarding usually tells us that it's the welfare of the child that should be paramount, and anything else, including the sort of cultural or religious views of parents, is a secondary concern. Safeguarding also tells us the most vulnerable are deserving of the greatest protections. And I guess if you just sort of imagine a parent going into a GP surgery and asking for a different healthy part of that child's body to be surgically removed, we wouldn't be accommodating those beliefs. The doctor would probably be calling social services.
Why do you think there is such a distinct difference between a small bit of the penis and the rest of the body?
Yeah, well, I guess I wouldn't call it a small bit of the penis, Lewis. So the foreskin is a specialized structure. So it's what we call in medicine a mucocutaneous junction. So the other parts of the body that are mucocutaneous junctions are the lips and the eyelids. So that means that you have skin on the outside and then a soft mucosa on the inside to protect the fragile structure underneath. So the foreskin is the most sensitive part of the penis to light touch and warmth. If you go on the NHS website and you look at the complications section of circumcision, you'll see that it will say that it can cause permanent reduction in sensation in the head of the penis, particularly during sex. That's also to be found in the British Association of Urological Surgeons guidance, which says that altered or reduced sensation will affect almost all patients. So that's, relatively new guidance, but that's not a new idea. So, since the 12th century, the extremely eminent Jewish sage and physician Maimonides, he said of circumcision that one of its objects is to limit sexual intercourse, to weaken the organ of generation as far as possible, to cause the man to be moderate, for there is no doubt that circumcision weakens the power of sexual excitement and lessens the natural enjoyment. Chabad, which is a Hasidic Jewish group which operates around the world, which I'm very fond of, they still have on their website today, they say circumcision purifies and refines. It forces us to make a sacrifice. Removing the foreskin diminishes the pleasure and enjoyment of intercourse.
So yeah, not a small part, even in the religions that are looking to remove it. But I guess the question still stands on that. What do you think the issue is between the way that government, the NHS, and everyone else is seeing that as, like, why is it not seen as the important part that it is? Why are these things still allowed to be carried out without a medical license, essentially?
Well, I suppose that it's a very long-standing practice in our country. So I think, in some sense, we've sort of either been blinded or sort of inoculated to the potential harms of it. And I think there's this sort of circularity of, circumcision is legal or is treated as legal under the law, and then the medical establishment says, okay, it's legal, so we need to permit it. So, and then they sort of go back and forth. So I think that is what is keeping us from examining this issue more clearly.
I imagine you have this problem with all of your campaigns, as they are sort of religious arguments, essentially. Those are institutions that have been around for hundreds and thousands of years, that have built up their sort of space in the world. When it comes to formulating these sort of campaigns and these arguments, is there an air of treading lightly or treading carefully? How do you sort of go around creating these campaigns?
Yeah, so freedom of religion is something to be celebrated, right? It's a hard fought right, and it's in fact one of our campaigns that we campaign to protect everybody's right to believe as they see fit, and we absolutely support the right of parents to raise their children in their religious tradition. Uh, but the right to manifest one's religious belief is a qualified right, and so that means it can be abridged in order to protect the rights and freedoms of others. So just by way of example, if you had a parent who was trying to refuse a blood transfusion for their child based on their Jehovah's Witness faith, we would say, yeah, you absolutely have a right to believe that this child should not be given a blood transfusion, but you don't have an absolute right to manifest that belief, to put that belief into the world, because that is infringing upon the rights of the child. And that's equally true of circumcision. So a child has an independent right to freedom of religion or belief. And you don't know when you perform a childhood circumcision whether a child is going to grow up to share their parents' religious belief. There's also, of course, the right to bodily autonomy, which is violated when you perform a childhood circumcision. And I think that's what really underpins why it should be deferred until the individual is old enough to decide for themselves based on their own values. Because when you do it at childhood, well, it's irreversible, and you're really rolling the dice on whether that person is going to be happy with what has been done to them. But if you wait until they're old enough to decide for themselves, then you don't have to take that risk.
Do you think that it's changing, or do you think that it's getting more split? So you spoke about the trend in America sort of decreasing, which is very much not a fashion statement, but very much just a way that America seemed to be. It seemed to be very common for the majority of American men to be sort of circumcised at a younger age, but that seems to be changing. So do you think that these specific circumcisions are moving more towards religious base rather than just a generic, we'll get it done when he's a child?
Well, it's hard to know in the UK because there are no centrally produced figures on this. But there was a report from the Institute of Jewish Policy Research last year, which found that there was an 85% circumcision rate in those polled. And that may sound high, but I was actually surprised by how low it was. I think if you had asked people a couple decades ago, it would have been nearly ubiquitous. And I think especially among younger Jewish parents, there is a trend towards deferring that decision until the individual can decide for themselves. I guess also there have been two very high-profile criminal convictions this year in the UK. So in January, Mohammed Siddiqui was jailed for 5 years for actual bodily harm and child cruelty. So this is a really remarkable case. So this gentleman was a doctor, and he'd actually been struck off in 2015 for dangerous and cruel circumcisions, but he could perfectly legally continue to circumcise boys as a layperson, as a non-doctor. So yeah, as we told the government, their legal arrangement is endangering the lives of children, and that was certainly borne out in the case of Siddiqui. So his circumcisions left boys' penises black, necrotic, inverted, smelling foul. One mother described her boy's penis exploding with blood. Another child was hospitalized for over 2 weeks and required quite invasive treatment, including a spinal tap. And the judge in that case, he said, I'm going to quote you here, safeguards and protections must now be put in place, and put in place as a matter of urgency, underlined, to ensure that babies and young children are protected. And then the second case, Mohammed Al-Azawi, so he was jailed for 9 years for wounding with intent, amongst other crimes, in July. And so this chap, he had no medical training whatsoever. He had a history of criminal violence, so he had been jailed previously for assaulting a lone woman, and he couldn't read or write English, which meant there would be no way he could assess a child's past medical history as written in their red book, or read any of the labels of the medicines that he was administering. But even when doctors perform circumcision, that's no guarantee that it's safe. So we sent a Freedom of Information request to the General Medical Council, which regulates doctors, asking what complaints they'd received about circumcision last year. And they told us that one child had been left with a, quote, mutilated penis, and another had almost died. So there are really quite serious harms when it's performed by lay people and by doctors.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think obviously your campaign as a whole is for mutilations of both genders, right? And one of the statements that you do have is that you want to see the same protection for girls, bodily autonomy extended to boys. What do you mean by that?
So under the FGM Act 2003, I think it's Section 1.5, it says that the belief of the individual or the person carrying out the operation is immaterial. So when it comes to male circumcision, I think a criminal ban in the first instance would be counterproductive. So we think that circumcision should be treated like any other surgery. So that means it should, when it comes to children, it should only be performed by a doctor, and only with medical necessity. So yeah, standards, safeguarding, and medical ethics should apply. But the comparison to FGM is an interesting one. So I'm not aware of any community that practices FGM that does not also practice circumcision. And I suppose that stands to reason in one sense. If you're comfortable with cutting the genitals of boys, why not also those of girls? And there's a very, very prominent anti-FGM campaigner here in the UK by the name of Nimco Ali. And she said in a 2021 interview that she thought that one of the main ways that we were going to stop FGM was, in fact, by ending the practice of male circumcision. And perhaps I could just tell you briefly about an interesting court case before the Family Division in 2015. So this is a case called Re B&G, and it was about whether two children, a boy and a girl, should be taken into care by the local authority. And this was because a scar was identified near the girl's clitoris, and there was some suspicion that she might have been subjected to a form of FGM, type 4 FGM, called clitoral nicking, which is pricking the clitoris with a needle to extract a single ceremonial drop of blood. And the judge said that, of course, would constitute significant harm under the Children Act, and would, if it were proven that had occurred, that the child should be taken into care. But he also quite bravely, in my opinion, also explored whether the boy, so this was a Muslim family, he explored whether the boy, who might later be subjected to circumcision, whether that would be grounds, whether that would constitute significant harm under the Children Act as well. And what he concluded was, in fact, that it did constitute significant harm, because it was more invasive than this form of FGM. But what he said was that we were ultimately willing as a society to tolerate it on the basis that it was a religious practice. So I think that's a really clear example of, I mean, I said in the introduction that part of our work is challenging religious privilege. And I think that's sort of the embodiment of religious privilege, that this is a practice that is more invasive than some forms of FGM, but we're willing to tolerate it on religious grounds. But I guess, if I were able to speak to that judge, I would point him to this very interesting YouGov poll from 2018, which found that actually the the public is quite opposed to this practice. So, 62% oppose the medically unnecessary circumcision of children, with only 13% in favor. And that was echoed in a poll of consultant pediatricians in North London last year as part of a study in the journal for the Royal College of Pediatrics, which found that 68% oppose the practice.
It's an interesting time for religion in the UK, I think. I think there seems to be a big conversation around the UK and its sort of religious stance, shall we say. Um, do you see now as a more fiery time to be having this conversation? Is it adding more fuel to a fire that's already burning quite brightly?
Well, I think circumcision is never a comfortable topic to discuss. Well, that's what I found. I found that people are always reluctant to discuss it with me. So, yeah, I suppose there is never, in some sense, a good time to discuss this. But, you know, taking a child-centered approach, the welfare of the child must be paramount. So we can't postpone uncomfortable discussions because of the current political climate. And I suppose what I would say when it comes to religious communities is that it's important not to treat them as a monolith. So there's a very powerful op-ed in the Telegraph a few years ago from the former editor of the Jewish Chronicle. So his name is Jake Wallace Simons, and he explained his decision not to circumcise his son Isaac. So I might just read a few bits of that briefly for you. He says, "Can we seriously be asked to believe that taking a scalpel to baby's genitals causes no damage? Is it really okay to cause pain to a child on the grounds they are too young to remember it later? I'm no woolly liberal. Children are born to a particular set of parents in a particular cultural context, and there's no point in running away from that. In the final analysis, however, I am proud that my wife and I have not caused Isaac any unnecessary pain and allowed him the freedom to decide." And I suppose that for some, circumcision will be a very powerful mark of identity. So it can be identity forming. But for others, it can actually be a huge barrier to connection with their religious background. So Dr. Leif Thompson, so he's a doctor from the US, from a Jewish background. He gave some very moving testimony at a sexual health conference earlier this year. And he says, if I sit down to a Shabbat dinner, this Friday night dinner in the Jewish community, I feel mild nausea. It's sitting in the house of the abuser. He says, for me, the biggest obstacle with feeling Jewish is what was done to me under the auspices of Jewish culture.
That's really interesting, a really sort of different thought process to it, that childhood trauma that's embedded without real thought at all. It's just sort of done as a
Yeah.
last.
And sorry, can I? I've.
Yeah, please.
I just have one more testimony, which I'd like to read to you, which is from a young man in Buckinghamshire, who I know personally, and he started a petition. So he's from a Jewish family. He was circumcised as a boy, and he started a petition to protect all children from medically unnecessary genital cutting. And yeah, I just wanted to read some of his testimony, which speaks to the spiritual effects, but also the really like quite profound effects on family dynamics. So he says, healthy tissue was cut from my body for no medical reason in the name of someone else's religious beliefs. I feel as though I have been marked or branded by a religion to which I am simply not a part of. What happened was permanent, irreversible, and without my consent. I live with a scar on the most sensitive and private part of my body. I'm reminded of this every time I go to the toilet. My parents, especially my mum, are the two people on this planet I hold most dear. I love them more than life itself, and I still do. But I also despise them. I've spoken to my parents about what happened and how I feel. My mum almost broke down into tears as soon as I raised the topic. I could tell how scarring that day was for her, let alone me. She wasn't the driving force behind the decision, but she was pressured by my father and his family and believed she failed in her duty as a mother to me. Devastatingly, I had to agree with her. The conversation was gut wrenching for both of us, but I knew it had to be done.
Yeah, it's powerful. It's powerful stuff where you start to wonder how many parents of these um, boys that felt that themselves, but maybe couldn't have aired it. Maybe to sort of tie it back into the sort of idea around the podcast itself, that sort of traditional masculinity sort of tied in with traditional religious values. Are they circumcising their boy even though they didn't want to be circumcised themselves? Like, where does the ripple sort of begin? If and only now, in a change of society where what is a man is changing, what is religion is also changing, and that's where these voices are able to come out. So it would be interesting to see how many elders within those religions feel similar but may not be able to voice it and are just doing it because that's how it was done, kind of thing.
Yeah. Um, yeah, it's a really interesting point. And I think all parents, almost all parents, want what is best for their children. And I think parents who decide to circumcise their children are no different. But yeah, as you say, I do think the weight of tradition plays very heavily here. And I think parents can be seriously conflicted. There's this sort of phenomenon among some Jewish parents, when the mum is pregnant, of sort of hoping for a girl, so that they won't have to go through this process. And I think that speaks to a really powerful, sort of maternal paternal instinct to protect one's children, and how this practice can sort of end up subverting that.
One of the points that you made at the beginning of that was that not many people want to talk to you about circumcision.
Yeah,
Why do you think that is?
it's a really good question. So my colleague at 15 Square, Leanne Morris, she's a trauma-informed therapist who works with men who feel harmed by circumcision. And I should just say that 15 Square is a charity that provides support for men who feel affected by this practice. So she talks about this really important concept of disenfranchised grief. So normally when you're grieving, say you've lost a family member, and you express that grief to someone, that grief will be acknowledged, right? It will be legitimized. You'll be empathized and sympathized with. But when it comes to circumcision, too often men are disbelieved when they express harm. They're ridiculed. I think if you just look at the sort of popular presentation of circumcision in our culture in Hollywood, it's always treated as a laughing matter. So yeah, when men speak up about this, they're far too often not validated, not recognized, and that shuts down the conversation, doesn't it? And that further perpetuates the idea that no one is harmed by this process because it's so difficult to speak out. And I guess one other dynamic at play is uh, acknowledging the harm of this is really difficult because, first of all, it requires acknowledging that you've been harmed. It requires acknowledging that that harm was perpetrated against you by your parent, or if you are the parent, that you in fact may have harmed your child. So that's an enormous obstacle in having conversations about this practice.
The when you say about the media, the only thing that sort of springs to mind is the Friends episode where Joey Tribbiani is going for a part and the director is extremely wants it to be extremely authentic and is looking for a non-circumcised man. I can't remember what the role is that he was playing, and they
Right.
start to create alternatives out of different objects to try and disguise
Yeah.
the fact that he doesn't have a foreskin. Obviously, there's that side of the media. It would be interesting. Do you know of any forms of content that sort of portray the negative sides, the harm sides, or anything that starts to unpick this a little bit more deeply?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can certainly recommend a few documentaries. So the BBC in 2019, an excellent journalist Adnan Sarwar, who's a chap from a Muslim family who's himself circumcised, did a very balanced, incredible job on exploring circumcision. So that documentary is called A Cut Too Far. There are also a few films from the US, the circumcision movie or American circumcision. What else? Here in the UK, there was a documentary in 1996 called It's a Boy, which, yeah, extremely powerful, quite graphic, but extremely powerful.
Are you positive or still negative in sort of the direction in which this is going? Do you feel it's going in the right direction, or do you feel that it's still sort of treading water and holding on?
Well, I'm cautiously optimistic, Lewis. So let's see. The government has, for the first time, acknowledged the harm and trauma that is being caused by unregulated circumcision, although they have also told us in, over the summer that they are not intending to do anything about it. But I do think men and boys' health is sort of being taken seriously in this cultural moment. So we've had the first ever men's health strategy launched this year, which I think is a testament to that fact. And we submitted evidence to that process, recommending that circumcision should be a part of that strategy. But what I would like to see more of is more listening, more compassion, more empathy, a greater willingness to put the welfare of the child at the heart of our decision making, and a greater willingness to act, even when it might be easier not to.
One of the other things that I sort of thinking about, saying that sort of thinking out loud, is when you look at religious sort of leaders and their sort of views on things. And I use Christianity as an example of this. There's been a more welcomeness to sort of gays within their community, and started to allow that within the church and that side of things. Are you
Mm.
seeing similar things in sort of the Jewish and Islamic religions? Are they starting to have more open conversations around the sort of genital mutilation? Is it sort of a preference rather than a desire or a need?
Well, certainly in the US, there's a fantastic Jewish group called Bruchim. And so what they're doing is they are developing a space for Jewish families who decide not to circumcise their boys. And they're also providing a sort of alternative welcoming naming ceremony on the eighth day of life, so it's a non-cutting ceremony, which they've called Brit Shalom, which I think is absolutely superb. Um, and what I would say is that circumcision, at least in the Jewish tradition, it has changed remarkably over the years. I mean, to a point that it would be almost unrecognizable. So originally, biblically, uh, Jewish circumcisions only involved removing the part of the foreskin that extended past the head of the penis. Um, Whereas nowadays it's a much lower, much more invasive form of circumcision. And I can get into the history of that if that would be of interest. But yeah, so what circumcision actually involved has changed. Who performs it has changed. So originally it was the father, but because it's become much more invasive, it's now performed by a specialized circumciser known as a machel. Jewish circumcision used to, well, in some cases it still does, but not generally not in the UK. It used to involve a rite called mitzitza b'peh, which is when the circumciser would apply direct oral suction to the circumcision wound. Um, that's largely been abandoned, largely on sort of sanitary and health grounds. So in the US, in New York, there were a couple of deaths that resulted as from this practice in the early 2000s because the babies contracted herpes, which went to the brain, and they died as a result of metsitsa. So that practice has largely been abandoned. And I suppose even the sort of origins of Jewish circumcision. So it was only sort of getting into the historical weeds here, but it was only during the Babylonian captivity that circumcision came to represent a covenant between God and the individual. It had quite different meanings before that. So what I would say is that, yes, there are some conversations going on in religious communities, and we do know that traditions can and sometimes should change.
That's really interesting. Why did it change from just a real small snip to a
Yeah. So when the Greeks conquered Jerusalem, they set up shop there and they set up their gymnasia, and Greek men were not circumcised, and they thought it was vulgar to have any part of one's glands, so the head of the penis, on display. And so some Jewish youths, they still had most of their foreskin, right? Because only the very tip had been cut off. So what they would do is they would pull up what the remaining skin to sort of emulate these Greeks and sort of mask the fact that they had been circumcised. And the powers that be were very unhappy with this practice, this emulation of the Greeks. And so they instituted this much more invasive form of circumcision called peria, which I believe means tearing. And so it involves a far more invasive form of circumcision that goes beyond just cutting the bit that goes beyond the glands to removing the foreskin in its entirety, essentially.
Interesting that it's well, that proves it can change, right? Which is a good conversation starter when you're sort of having that conversation with someone around this subject. You touched on it briefly, but sort of going back to sort of the men and boys space as a whole, what is it that you like right now, and what do you want to see a little bit more of?
Well, yeah, as I said, I think it's great that we've had the first ever men's health strategy. It's great that a dedicated think tank has been set up this year relating to men and boys health. So yeah, that's what I think is working well. And as I said, yeah, more listening, more compassion, more empathy, and a greater willingness to act is what I would like to see next.
Amazing. Alejandro, it's been an absolute pleasure. It's been really interesting. I've actually learned a lot, which is amazing. And I think it's a conversation that was well needed and should be had. As you say, the government's created this think tank, and I want to voice all corners of that and sort of showcase man as one. If people have liked what they've heard and they want to find out more, what's the next steps for them?
So the next steps for them, I would recommend Googling the National Secular Society. If you go to our healthcare section of our website, you'll find all of our work on ritual genital cutting. So of course, I would encourage you to join or donate if you support our work on this front. We also have a template letter that you can send to your MP, asking them to acknowledge this issue. If you want to follow me on Twitter, my handle is Logomachist, which is Logomachist.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. I will leave the final thoughts with yourself.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Lewis. It's so great that you are willing to take on this difficult subject when it would certainly be easier not to. I hope this has been interesting for your listeners, and I hope it's been convincing that we should all be standing up for freedom of religion or belief, but not when it infringes upon the rights of others. And when it comes to children, we need to be protecting the most vulnerable.